everyone. Welcome to the Scorpion Podcast. I'm Jordan. I'm joined here by Flying Kabbalah and Jacob. We're a collective of, broadly speaking, intellectuals, creators, thinkers, artists, and content creators who try to gather knowledge and wisdom with which we can better ourselves in the world, proliferate that knowledge to others, and make sense of the world really to the greatest extent possible. And as part of this journey, as you know, if you've been watching our recent podcasts and the videos we've been putting out in recent months, our varied interests in our broader project has been converging towards a fairly cohesive, yet of course highly intricate understanding of the world. One which, in the simplest possible terms, because we'll obviously dive into this in more detail in this podcast, centers on the clash between these two geopolitical power blocks, which one could roughly term the West, perhaps, and the East, on the other hand, and which are underpinned by completely antithetical ideologies, philosophies, and worldviews, and which all combines with deeply related developments such as artificial intelligence, transhumanism, which in their totality seem to be coalescing towards really an apocalyptic future, and potentially even a post-human future. It's the dethroning of mankind from the top of the ontological hierarchy, as I've put it in the past in my own writings. But what today's podcast in particular focuses on with this broader theme in mind is a mini essay that I wrote about a week ago. And it was written in a completely spontaneous manner, or completely impromptu, in our Discord group chat where we plan our podcasts. And that means that I wrote it with no notes and really over the span of just about 10 minutes with nothing else but my mind, the thoughts floating in my mind, and the knowledge that I already had. And it was written in response to some messages that Killian, our good friend and our fellow Scorpion Movement member and contributor, who unfortunately isn't going to be able to join us for this podcast today, it seems, but we're going to keep in mind, obviously, because considering that he really spurred this specific topic in this essay that I wrote. Some messages that he sent into Discord concerning this end of history topic. And now you could probably write entire treatises, books, PhD theses, even films perhaps, on the topic of the end of history alone, and many people have, right? I mean, it's quite a hot topic in any circles that discuss topics like politics, philosophy, history, current events, culture, right? And many people trace this idea and this concept back to the thinker Francis Fukuyama, who in 1992 originally published a very popular and quite well-known book, considering that it's a political philosophy book, which is not most generally speaking, the most accessible topic, titled "The End of History and the Last Man." Now, although I respect Fukuyama as a thinker and an intellectual in my own work, and I think to an extent in the work that we do as a collective, I don't necessarily tie this concept to him specifically. I think it's mostly unnecessary to do that, and I think the only reason one would even do that in the first place is if they didn't really have the deepest understanding of this topic, and so they have to attach it to a fairly well-known name within mainstream academia. And I do think the fact that Francis Fukuyama has been really embedded in the upper echelons of power, and in the academic institutions, I think he's taught at universities like Stanford for a while, has really facilitated the popularity of his book. But these types of, and his thesis, but these types of ideas have been explored to potentially to even greater detail and with a greater degree of brilliance by thinkers that long antedated Fukuyama, many of whom actually inspired him, right? Thinkers like Hegel and Kojève. But even then, you don't need to actually trace it back to those thinkers in particular. We can just explore this as an idea, independently as an idea, right? And so I'll sum it up quite briefly here before I'll allow Jacob and Flying Kabbalah to speak about this if they have any introductory thoughts. Because again, this is really the backdrop, you could say, of my essay, the mini essay that I wrote that we're going to be discussing. But essentially, the end of history concerns this idea that, if you look at human history, if you engage in what's called hermeneutics, you could say, which is the art of interpretation in its simplest sense, you can trace certain patterns. And that's really what I think the truly skilled historian's job is to do, right? Is to trace certain patterns in history, not just to memorize specific dates or the names of specific individuals, but to look for broader themes, right? Themes that intersect and crisscross different epochs and time periods throughout history. And you can detect this very, very broad pattern, you could say, of this idea of a linear progression, right? This is also going to be important when we get into Kant. We're going to talk about Kant and Kantianism a bit later on because I wrote about that in this essay. But this idea that, well, mankind starts essentially in um, this base, uncivilized, irrational, animalistic state where we're controlled by our passions, where we um, are essentially entirely subordinate to our worst tendencies and our most animalistic inclinations, right? Violence, the sort of primitive behaviors, combat, right? Which leads to an early death. Of course, this is also very important in the ideas of thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, right? Who I think really phrases well when he says, well, the state of nature is a state of brutality, of combat, of paranoia, in the sense that humans have to be constantly vigilant, constantly on the alert for really their fellow man who will, in the absence of any sovereign or any ruler or higher authority, will be inclined and actually incentivized to take advantage of them and to violently dominate them so as to acquire their resources, essentially, and to maximize their own power, which is also the foundation of realism in international relations theory, which is something that we could get into more detail perhaps later on. Um, and on the note of Hobbes, I don't want to get into too much detail on this right now because I do want to transition to the essay, but it's really all quite important because these are very, very dense and intricate topics, and it's good for providing contextualization. But on the note of Hobbes, he says, well, this is a very pitiful and brutal state. And so it's no surprise that we humans relinquish some of our freedoms, essentially, some of the authority and autonomy that we would have over our own lives, or self-determination in a sense, on the individual level, not on the societal level, because this is before society even comes into picture. This is the state of nature. We relinquish some of our freedoms so that we can join this contract, this collective called society, which is controlled by the sovereign. And so what he writes is essentially that these tendencies towards violence, towards domination and power, which are really at the core of human nature, because he has quite a pessimistic view of human nature, right? And this is tied to realism, essentially gets sublimated, or perhaps you could say sublated into the sovereign. Now the sovereign becomes the one who actually carries out and directs this violent will onto the populace, in a sense. But it's actually done, he believes, really voluntarily by humans, so that we can forsake this state of brutality and violence and pursue higher ends, higher goals, right? And that social contract theory also gets explored by thinkers like Locke and Rousseau, and it's really the part of the bedrock of modern liberalism in a sense, which is what is the predominant form of political and societal organization, and at least in the West. Obviously, outside of the West, it's a much different story, of course, as we've talked about extensively in the past. And a key theme there, actually, with Hobbes, that I want you guys, and by you guys, I mean really everyone who's listening to this or everyone who's into this podcast, to pay attention to a very interesting kind of finding or theme here, which is that a very, very influential idea in this case, one which completely transformed the course of human history and which shapes the societies that we live in today, at least in the West, stems, in my view, this is my contribution. I haven't really seen too many other people write about this. Maybe there are some who have, but as far as I'm aware, my distinct contribution here is that this idea of this type of sublimation, of essentially, of this innate human tendency towards violence and domination into the sovereign, which forms the basis of this social contract theory of liberalism, reflects to a significant extent really the personality and the psychological tendencies of the guy who created this concept, Hobbes. I mean, you can explain that 90% of this based on that alone. And that's something that I find really fascinating because that's going to come in actually when we talk about game theory, which is something that plays a key role in the modern day mechanisms of control that we're going to talk about today, right? Because you can really trace game theory back. Obviously, it's heavily tied to cybernetics, and so for cybernetics, people like von Neumann, the mathematician and computer scientist, and Wiener are very important. But you can really trace game theory back to a significant extent to John Nash. And most people, I imagine that many of the people who watch this podcast would probably be aware of who John Nash is. I mean, of all of the mathematicians throughout human history, I'd say he's definitely one of the more well-known, maybe because this movie was made about him called The Beautiful Mind. But you can actually, first of all, he was a paranoid schizophrenic, which is quite interesting. But you can trace his ideas, his contributions to game theory. This idea that and which he applies to humans to say that humans are essentially rational actors that perform cost-benefit calculations to determine how to go about their lives, right, and how to shape society. You can actually trace this back to the fact that he himself was essentially an extremely selfish and pessimistic person who behaved personally in that manner and extrapolated down to everyone else. So you can literally trace back this world-changing, society-controlling idea to a single personality trait, pretty much. And this is something that John Nash actually admitted later on in his life, I think maybe in his memoir. So that alone is just an interesting theme that I want to keep in mind. We can tie that actually to the idea of the great man. Um, if you look at the philosophy of history, the idea of the great man, that history is shaped by these world historical individuals, right? Great men who embody the certain admirable or rare traits, whether it's perseverance, heroism, intelligence, strength, right? How in a very dialectical fashion, this is actually a concept that is heavily negated or discouraged by modern liberalism in a sense, which is all about egalitarianism and leveling. But at the same time, many of the mechanisms of control that align with modern liberalism and which stem from it in a sense, such as game theory and cybernetics, as well as even the social contract theory more fundamentally in a sense, actually stem from this very process of individuals with unique personalities pretty much transforming the world. And so there's a very interesting dialectical contradiction there. This system essentially hates what actually constitutes it in this really strange sense, which is very Hegelian. So that's something that we could get into just to lay the groundwork. Now, Flying Cabal and Jacob, I know I've been talking and rambling for a long time. So my apologies if any of that was a bit excessive, but what would you guys just have to say to lay some groundwork concerning this end of history concept? It's something we've obviously talked about this before, especially in the first episode. But if you guys have your own unique thoughts about this, any contributions that you'd like to make, just go ahead right
Yeah,
now.
I actually wanted to
Send you
interrupt you,
guys into
Jordan, on
yes,
the
yeah,
note that you made regarding the paranoid schizophrenic who made
John.
these mathematical contributions to cybernetics. What was his name?
John
Well, I
Nash.
mean, I guess John Nash. I guess more specifically game theory, but it's all heavily
Yeah.
interrelated. So yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
you
Yeah.
mentioned that I believe it was you said that he was the one who extrapolated like his basic human tendency and applied it to the rest of the world and passed that as a revelation.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, he assumed that people behave in this way because he behaved in that way,
Yeah,
which
I think that's the pattern with everyone. As we delve into these philosophers and into these theories, we often find that people assume everyone thinks in a way that they do. I find that that's like a huge cognitive bias that we have. And as I've been reading particularly into like literature and philosophy, a lot of the thoughts that are passed on by philosophers as tendencies of the human species are just these introspective thoughts that they have about themselves. So much is biased by our tendency to examine ourselves and apply that to other human beings. um and I find that psychology mainly has been the main field that's been sort of diving into the minds of other people and trying to see how they think. But before that,
yeah.
everything predates the main school of psychology, which this was, started around the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Has this huge like cognitive bias, and I find it interesting that even in the modern day, you see a lot of people make these grand political statements, and I find this is particularly true like on the far left, and they make these grand assumptions about the whole of humankind that's really just based off of their own cognitive processes.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. It's actually interesting, isn't there? Because I know that you're a psychology major and you're really into psychology, which I am too. I mean, I don't like study it at the academic level like you do, but isn't there some research in psychology that actually has almost proven this empirically? I might be mistaken, but isn't there something like this in this regard? Um,
As an academically, is there an academic basis for this?
yeah, it's something. I remember reading about this, like in the
Well,
psychology
I mean,
literature.
I think generally
But
speaking,
this,
I think it's something obvious because I think that every single human mind that exists and has existed is parochial in its own nature. It's limited by its own social or by its own psychological processes. So you could just look at it from that aspect. I don't think it's something that requires.
Yeah, it's called the false consensus effect,
Yeah,
and
that's what I was
basically when individuals overestimate the extent to which their beliefs and habits are normal and typical of other people.
Yeah, that I think that's close to what I was looking for. But we're definitely going to talk about psychology on this podcast as well, because these types of models, which disguise themselves as really just objective or scientific means of understanding the world and of understanding human behavior. Because again, you can't separate human behavior from the world, right? That's like one of the big tendencies that I find people make is they try to separate an understanding of what they consider to be the natural world from the social world, as if they're completely, as if on the basis of their own paradigms, the human being is not somehow constituted by what makes up the natural world. So they actually enter a self-contradiction in that regard, because these people tend to be materialists, in the simplest sense, which in the simplest sense says that basically reality is just composed of matter, material entities that interact with each other physically, and so you can empirically analyze them, because we actually have to empirically analyze them considering that. And at the same time, they try and separate the study of man from the study of nature in a sense, which is you can't do that. You can't extricate man from the world. Like these models of control that we're going to talk about, like I've said, which disguise themselves as just scientific means of understanding the world, but which are actually heavily ideological, and which have a specific intent to essentially control people and to conduct mass-scale sociological engineering. They stem actually from these mathematical models, right? These mathematical and computational models. And I think that's even infected psychology to an extent. I mean, it took over the social sciences in general. Like I mentioned in the essay, you open up any social science textbook, whether it's political science, economics, right, sociology, and there are all these quantitative models and things like econometrics and the prisoner's dilemma and the Nash equilibrium, which are all based on these, mathematical models of human behavior. And that even affects language, the perception of what language is, which is, fundamental really to humankind, to what it means to be a human. I do want to talk about how this has affected language as well. But anyways, like I said, I want to let you, Flying Kabbalah, provide your input on the end of history concept, or really on anything that we've just touched on so far in this podcast. And we're really just getting started, and it's actually amazing that we've already covered so many fascinating and dense areas.
Right. So on this podcast, we were planning on discussing game theory and cybernetics.
Yeah.
Before we actually get into that more explicitly, I want to make a mention of in a sense, of the fact that philosophically, or if one wishes to analyze the history of philosophy, generally speaking, I think that we can make the deduction that there have been two camps, in a sense. So that have both permeated from ancient times to modern times. And then, so one of these camps is the logicians, right? So the people that think that pretty much logic is something that is monolithical, in a sense that thinking or analysis in and of itself is something as it's something that's not able to be broken. So I think several philosophers in particular, or several thinkers, can be cited in order to in order to substantiate that categorization. So the Enlightenment thinkers definitely fit into that. So Locke, Hume, Descartes, Leibniz, Kant.
We're going to get into Leibniz
right?
specifically.
Yeah, exactly. We're definitely going to be looking at Leibniz. And when we get into modern social sciences, we get people like Nash, or John Nash, as you were talking about, and then the people
also a mathematician, which is it's tough.
So
yeah,
in particular, it's people that pretty much think of thinking like as if humans are bots in a sense, or robots, or as if thinking is math.
Yes.
Yeah, and then the other camp that I wanted to discuss are, maybe this is not the best label for it, but you could label it as the emotionalists, or people that place more of an emphasis on feeling itself, or just on experience, if that sounds like a better categorization, or like a better definition. So I think Nietzsche definitely comes to mind, Heidegger, and then we get to postmodernists like Deleuze, right? That didn't really think of thinking as something that is a monolith, like Leibniz, for instance, did. You could, I think, even cite people like Jean Baudrillard, and some other people.
Amazing thinker. Yeah.
Yeah. But frankly, I don't really have very strong opinions on either one of these camps, because I do think that you get good ideas from both of them. But I think really as you get, or as one realizes that the sort of advancement, or just, if not that advancement, because that implies momentum, but at least the predominance of the sort of corporocratic and robotic tendencies that we see in modern Western life, you can kind of see which one tends to predominate, because, so, I mean, in other words, it's the logicians. Because if we analyze...
Putting Deleuze in the same camp as Jean Baudrillard is ambitious, I must say, but continue.
I mean, you could both, they both, were affiliated with the same intellectual circles in France, were they not? I mean, the 70s and 80s. Like the
I do get it. Still ambitious. Continue, Flying
Kabbalah, because... Go ahead, Flying Kabbalah.
Yeah, okay, whatever. So, I think really where cybernetics comes into this in game theory is that it really, in a sense, roboticizes human thinking. So I think right now would actually be a pertinent or an applicable time, or just a relevant time to bring up cybernetics as a concept. So for those not familiar with the term, it was a concept and a term itself that was coined by a man called Norbert Wiener. And he was a Jewish computer scientist. He was working, I believe, with another Mexican Jew by the name of Arturo Rosenbluth. And it was I think it was coined in the 1940s. So the term itself comes from the ancient Greek word Kybernetes, which means steersman. In other words, the guy that steers the ship. So why is that the case? That's because when, a ship is sailing on high waters, for instance, when there's a storm out and there are lots of waves, the guy that's steering the ship adjusts the ship so that it can go in a straight course and finally reach its destination. So by extension, so using that same concept, cybernetics uses feedback, right, and just the input and output within any system in order to adjust, right, the sort of system in order for it to go into what is perceived to be the right direction, right, or the direction that you want it to go into. So that's why in a sense it's important to the functionality of all systems that exist. So whether it be conversation, whether it be robotics, coding, or even economics, whatever.
Yes.
So it's in a sense a sort of universal language. But if you apply cybernetics to thinking, in my opinion at least, it's something that's very materialistic.
Yes, that's the basis of it in a sense.
Right. And I think game theory also comes in as something relevant here. So game theory, actually, Jordan, can you define that more? Because I mean, I can bring up several examples, but it's so like the prisoner's dilemma, but I don't really have the definition right in front of me.
What it basically studies is it entails the use of mathematical models to study. This sounds like a very textbook definition, but I think it's the clearest way to define it, right? It forms mathematical models to study interactions among and between rational actors or rational agents, right? So that's why, and it's interesting how much this language has actually permeated, contemporary culture and contemporary political analysis to such a significant extent, right? If you turn on your news, your average news station, whether it's CNN or Fox News, and they get on a quote unquote political analyst or a political expert or political commentator, whatever exact term they use, to talk about some given country, they'll often say things like, X country, say China, is an actor, or they'll say something like, China, maybe China or Iran is an irrational actor, or this
Oh
country
God, you
is
see
a,
this with Russia tons
yeah,
since
you see, yeah,
China
isn't
entered the
it, isn't
Ukrainian
this
war.
so, it's something that's so ubiquitous, right? And it's like people can't, it seems like people
Yeah.
haven't quite put their finger on this, but if you think about it, you notice it, and, that's always something that actually puzzled me a bit. It's like, it seemed almost like these guys were getting fed the same script,
Hmm.
that told them to sort of repeat these like mimetic terms pretty much, like,
Yeah,
you know,
because they are,
Russia
dude.
isn't,
Every single I see a new article on how Russia is going to nuke the world. And I'm sorry, I'm no pro-Putin propagandist. I'm no advocate of Putin.
Right.
But I don't think if there has been an article every single week since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine over 2 and almost 2.5 years ago, that is suddenly next week Putin is going to blow up the world. There's this sudden like mainstream, this it's not even news because it's old. It's this source of like mainstream how do you call it? It's just the same repeated
Propaganda.
literacy arguments, the same dialectic recycled over and over and over again. And you see this for multiple topics. So yeah, it's
no,
like
exactly.
pushing the population in a very specific direction.
Yeah, it's pretty much.
Programming.
Yeah, exactly. Program. It's permeated culture, permeated political analysis. Actually, many, I've had to hang around and sort of associate with, just out of necessity, many people who are classified as political scientists by academia. That's their official job title, and they use this language all the time as well, describing countries as actors, right? As if you can actually essentially reduce a country, which is this extremely complex, organism in a sense, to basically an entity that acts, right? And so from there, they divide these entities into rational and irrational actors, right? Political scientists use this terminology all the time, and I've always found it to be quite strange. I mean, both strange and interesting. But it's political scientists, it's political commentators, right? They use this type of language all the time, and but it always is used in a manner that is normative in a sense. And what I mean by that is, when they describe a given country or a group as an irrational actor, they're not just giving a pure description or a pure statement of fact, which they might actually conceal it as a pure statement or a statement of fact. But it's normative in the sense that they're actually implicitly condemning, in a sense, that actor for being irrational. Oftentimes we see that manifest when when they refer to not only countries like Russia, as you mentioned, but countries like Iran as irrational actors. Therefore, they can't be trusted, right? Therefore, we can't peacefully negotiate them. Like, we, being the West and countries like America, we can't engage in these nuclear treaties with them, or peace treaties, because they'll just simply renege on them because they're irrational actors. They don't behave like us rational actors in the West. Even though they might not refer to themselves as actors, they haven't perhaps internalized it quite to that degree. And when if they refer to another country, which they define as an entity, really, as this kind of monadic entity, you could say, if you want to make parallels to Leibniz, when they refer to that country as a rational actor, it's almost a sign of, it's like they're bestowing a certain privilege upon that actor, or maybe not necessarily privilege, but they're bestowing a degree of honor and respect upon that actor. And I hate using this terminology actor, but I'm using it because of the framework that's then laid out by game theory, right? So you already see there immediately this dichotomy between rational and irrational as as positive and negative respectively. Like, it's implicitly actually a moral and normative question. And that's another theme that I think we should dive into, right? And that's going to pop up time and time again as we explore as these topics. This theme that we see where, and you have to analyze it quite closely to detect this, but where you could say intellectual tools, or intellectual activities disguise themselves as completely objective, or just scientific in nature. And obviously the most fundamental and easy to detect version of this would be science itself, right? I mean, that's where scientific comes from. But tools like science, mathematics, right? Even many of the social sciences, you could say, which have been infected by these models like game theory, like economics, political science to an extent, perhaps psychology to an extent. Maybe Jacob later could touch more on psychology. They, they all carry this notion, in a sense, that they are pursuing this, they're following this objective pursuit of knowledge, right? Knowledge of an objective world that exists externally of humans, in a sense, independently of human perception, that is accessible to all of us, that is necessarily based on the fact that it exists objectively. So as an object, if you want to talk about the subject-object distinction, right? Because that's actually the basis of science, in a sense. You have to posit that there's a human subject that observes some type of object, which is a dichotomy that in itself actually might be somewhat destructive. That's obviously another deep dive. But by virtue of the fact that you posit an objective world, that world has to present itself in the same manner to everyone, right? And so from there, you see there's this understanding that arises that, if something is scientific, it's essentially superior to a non-scientific understanding of the world, right? This ties into obviously what I was talking about earlier, this idea of a linear progression throughout history, this sort of the piercing arrow of progress. And I actually linked this in my own writings recently. I've been doing a lot of research on how this relates to notions of time, of space, of quantity, of what those things are and how we define them. I do want to get into that later because it's quite fundamental here. But that notion, that process is driven essentially by this privileging of, quote unquote rational and objective understandings over non-scientific understandings. And so what presents itself as a completely objective and ultimately noble process actually conceals really an ideology, these ideological mechanisms and these mechanisms of control, right? So there's this actually inherent contradiction in science itself, because the moment that you try to define it as an objective means of understanding the natural world, and therefore as a superior one, you already contradict and negate your own assumption that it's objective, because you're inherently privileging it over some non-scientific model that you essentially project, right? So you already enter a state of contradiction, because that act of privileging can't actually be justified, as we know, on the basis of science alone, right? Because science is not really supposed to concern itself with normativity and with ethical and moral questions. That's always been considered to fall outside the boundaries of science, because science is supposed to be purely experimental, right? So it's quite telling, actually, that when you delimit and you restrict your scope of knowledge and understanding to the scientific method, you would get this experimental model, where you essentially just accumulate results over and over again, right? You perform tests and observations, right? You test hypotheses. It's very, very telling that that is what happens when you delimit your understanding of the world to science, right? This experimental modality. So you could call it, an experimental phenomenology. Phenomenology is basically, because I don't want to get too heavy into the jargon here, phenomenology is essentially how, you perceive the world. It's the study of perception, right? It's very telling that that's what happens, right? Now, on this note, I wanted to say, because Flying Kabbalah, you brought up, you went from talking about Leibniz to Deleuze, right? Well, it's actually interesting that you mentioned those two thinkers, because, and this is, I'm just going to mention this because I also wanted to ask you more briefly what you think about the end of history specifically and how you define that. But before I get to that, Deleuze actually is famous because he inverts, in a sense, the Leibnizian understanding of the world, right? Because Leibniz, and we're going to get into this in more detail when we do a deep dive on Leibniz, because he's a very important and kind of suspicious figure. But Leibniz is famous for his monadology, right? This monadological understanding of the world, which I don't like calling it a metaphysics, because I think it's actually a lot more fundamental than that. But he basically thought that all of reality, and even of understanding, in a sense, like literally knowledge, ideas, intellectual production, which, by the way, if you take a materialist perspective, this is very, very important as we get into the ideas concerning human nature and how that's defined by not only by intelligence and language, and because if you assume a materialist understanding of the world, as I mentioned earlier, that the world is essentially composed of these physical and material entities that interlock with each other in this mechanistic fashion. You basically have the world as a giant machine. Then actually some things even as abstract as knowledge and ideas, which we generally wouldn't really think of as physical, just on an intuitive basis, as existing in the physical world, actually become physical. They're inherently part of. They're no different than a chair or a table or just something that you can touch physically, in terms of their substance and their constitution, right? And then if you have that understanding, well, then that means that you can actually really manipulate, sort of mechanically manipulate, through mathematical and computational means, not only consciousness but language itself, right? And this is very, very important as we get into cybernetics and game theory, and the assumptions that they make about human nature, and based on defining human nature in terms of intelligence, in terms of language. This is going to pop up when you get into AI, right, which is obviously based fundamentally on simulating language. You actually don't get the simulation of language that's at the heart of AI itself if you don't presuppose these basic ideas, right? And I'm going to talk about this a bit later when I get into linguistics, and how linguistics essentially transitioned roughly in the 20th century, into a heavy from the focus on things like morphology and etymology, and the sort of romantic aspects of language, that is, language as situated in cultures and societies, to a study of syntax, right? This occurs roughly in the 20th century, which is also, incidentally, when you see the rise of models like cybernetics and game theory, right? Because in my view, this technocratic order that really pushes all of this, obviously the roots lay really in this fund that you could say possibly even going back to the Socratics, right? The transition from the pre-Socratics to the Socratics is very significant. The roots of this go back to these fundamental ideas about what space, time, and quantity are, and I want to talk about that a bit later. But I think this technocratic kind of block really consolidated itself and took over the world in simple terms in the 20th century, which is also when you see all of these developments come into play, right? Cybernetics, game theory, these ideas about linguistics that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about Noam Chomsky. He's quite significant for this because he's really groundbreaking in linguistics. Obviously, he has this idea of universal grammar and generative grammar, which is a theory of
Well,
human
actually,
language.
just kind of
But yeah, I wanted a
talking
bit of
about something that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think
Wait,
you made an
can I say
interesting
one thing?
parallel
Sorry,
between.
wait, 1 second, bro. One thing really quickly. What I'll say is, because I think some people will expect us to just some people might assume right now that we're just like going over the essay point by point as I originally wrote it. That's not quite what we're doing. We're sort of just riffing on some basic concepts that are related to it, but at the same time, it is going very well. So I just wanted to make that clear for the people that are watching. But yeah, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
You did mention the fact that a lot of these models, so for instance, game theory and cybernetics, kind of took over in the latter half of the 20th century. And I think something that you could also point out is that lots of these rationalizations also took place in the early 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, and how Romanticism was in reaction to the Industrial Revolution, materialism, right, rampant at the time. So, like, it is in a sense kind of a dialectic process. And also, I found interesting that you mentioned the transition from the pre-Socratics to the Socratics, because I believe it's one of the pre-Socratics had... Okay, do you remember his name? That had lots of similarities with people that I already mentioned earlier, with kind of in the emotionalist category. So Nietzsche and Heidegger, more emphasis on personal experience. It's not Epicurus, but...
Well, I mean, there's so many people I could just name off the top of my head, but I'm
you're right.
thinking
Anyways,
yeah, go ahead.
That transition, in a sense, symbolizes, right, that transition from experience or personal experience to rationalization of everything. So that happened under Platonism. Obviously also Aristotelianism, because I mean, I think Aristotle was very rational in his approach to analyzing anything. So, for instance, rhetoric,
Yes.
physics, metaphysics, and stuff like that.
Oh, Aristotle is very significant actually in this work. You could trace when I'm talking about the fundamental views of time, space, and quantity that I think are at the heart of this quote unquote this process of linear progression that you could say that's actually really culminating in the destruction and the complete phasing out of the very human beings that actually proposed in the first place, which is a necessary result of its actual inherent tendencies, right, in its constitution. But I think you can actually trace this back in a sense to Aristotelianism. That's what I'm gonna get into that. But what I was saying with, I didn't get sidetracked. I followed this sort of line of thought. But with Leibniz, right? The monad. So I explained why that's significant in a sense. But this idea that you define reality is composed of these individual entities, right? And they eventually they kind of combine with each other, and they unfold in this process of infinite complexity in a sense, and that's how you get reality, right? And then from there we can do a bit of a deeper dive on Leibniz as we actually go through this essay kind of line by line, paragraph by paragraph. But from there he actually defines reality, or that is the greatest possible reality, the kind of ideal reality, which he says is this world, because he views this integration of all possible knowledge, or rather this production of all possible knowledge through this sort of combinatorial process, as something that will inevitably happen, right? He's almost like a teleological thinker in this sense. Even though no one interprets Leibniz in this way, but I do, because he's saying that no, this integration of all possible knowledge and this production of all possible knowledge, and not only that, essentially the outsourcing of the production of knowledge and intellectualism itself to machines, so that we can, which is what his combinatorial machine is about, so that we can, basically facilitate world peace and just live these very kind of not simply hedonistic, but kind of empty lives where we can just pleasure ourselves and live in peace and contentment, right? He actually views this as something that will inevitably happen, really, as mankind progresses, which is very telling, right? This idea of progress is something that we've dissected time and time again in this podcast. But he defines essentially the perfect reality then, which he views as inevitably destined to happen, teleologically speaking, as the reality that possesses essentially the greatest quantity, like the greatest possible number of everything, right? So maximal quantity, maximum presence, right? So there's already this privileging of presence over absence, which is something that's also important when you go into dissecting Aristotle, right? Because he also does this too when he defines time and space and number, I think in the physics, right? Where he gives his definition of time. But that's how Leibniz defines the perfect version of reality. And so he says, I'm going to get into this a bit later when we talk about Leibniz in more detail, but he says that, well, if you can, if you can fully realize and sort of instantiate this world, this integration and this combination of all possible knowledge, right? And basically what you could call this, some people have called it the noosphere, which is in reference to this idea that there are different spheres of life and existence, right? You might have heard about this, the biosphere, the geosphere. Some people have added on to this idea of a noosphere that is essentially emerging, which is really the culmination of this Leibnizian model, this Leibnizian viewpoint, right? Where all of knowledge and intellectualism is integrated in this kind of this cosmic network, where you can literally plot out pretty much everything that exists on a kind of a nodal network, you could say, like a screen that almost resembles the way that neuroscientists have mapped out the brain. And by the way, neuroscience is also part of this giant mechanism of control, right? So that's the Leibnizian viewpoint, and he actually, because he was a Christian, as you said earlier, he views this as actually as God's kind of plan for the world. He says, God wants to create this. Actually, he basically allows this to happen, right? That's where his Christianity penetrates into this, and so in a sense, you could say that, with that in mind, these technocratic models of control, right? Corporate capitalism, all this actually has become God in a sense, or at least it aims to become God, because it does aim to instantiate all of this, right? But that's Leibniz, and Deleuze obviously would be against all of this. He's a really interesting guy. I like him a lot. He inverts that actually with his nomadology, So he has in one of his big works that's part of um, Anti-Oedipus. I think it's 1,000 Plateaus, because Anti-Oedipus is divided into capitalism and schizophrenia in the 1,000 Plateaus, right?
Yeah.
In 1,000 Plateaus, there's actually an essay. It's called Nomadology: The State in the War Machine, and um, many people, I think many people completely misread that one. They think that it's a text about literal nomads, like as in the sense of people who, um, move from place to place and don't never actually settle permanently in one area, and about actual nomadic warriors. But that, which is a kind of a part of it in a very vulgar sense, but that even that phrase itself, nomadology, is a very specific reference to Leibniz's monadology. It's like a word, a sort of wordplay, an inverse of that, right? And Deleuze, we can talk about Deleuze if you want later. I didn't write his name down and his ideas down specifically in my notes, but yeah, we can talk about him later. And he's significant in this sense because one, so what nomadology is about, in a very simplified way, obviously because it's quite complex, is he's contrasting the state with the war machine, right? And so the state, and he also contrasts this with what he calls royal science and nomad science, respectively, right? The state, he says, is fundamentally sedentary, right? And what he means by that is, it stays in one place, but he's really using this phrase sedentary in a broader sense to describe um, this idea of a linear progression, sort of not really just humanity, but reality itself, right? Because the end goal of all of these schemes is to initiate a congruence, right, between the world as is and this kind of giant model of the world, like this world simulation, this world model. This is what I talked about in the essay, right? To generate a congruence between these two, and you have to do that through social engineering and all of these types of mechanisms of control, right? This entire process, you could say, of linear progression, even though you would assume that the term progression implies a change, right? That's what's almost necessitated by the term. If you're progressing, you're becoming something else, right? You're changing, if you apply this, for example, to the individual level, you're changing from who you were yesterday, right? That's kind of what progress means in this simple, vulgar sense. So even though definitionally you would expect linear progress to be about change, the very fact that alone that it constitutes itself on this basis of linear progress, that you just move in a specific direction forward perpetually, and that's the only direction that you move in. There's this unidirectionality, right? That actually creates this sense of eternality, because where in this dialectical process, change itself actually becomes nullified. There is no change, because every quote unquote change that happens really just represents a manifestation of the same process, this culmination really of a certain process. If you move in just one direction, you actually cancel out change. Like, you cancel out change and entropy in a sense. You get this staticness, right? This eternality. And actually, I don't know if I included a note in this essay, but I wanted to talk a bit about physics and cosmology, because it's also kind of tied into this, because there is this idea. Einstein actually formulated this, I think, in 1917. He wrote a paper on his cosmological model of a static, flat, and eternal universe. And even though it sounds quite abstract, that is something that you could actually connect this to as sort of the end point um, of these processes of control and this idea of linear progress. That is actually the world that it essentially creates, right? Because in order to mathematize, and this is tied more fundamentally to what mathematics is, but on a very simple level, in order to express something mathematically or computationally, not only are you presupposing identity, right? That things should be oriented towards their equals. So there's this idea of equality, right? That's the basis of any mathematical equation. And even when math examines, difference, like in a very broad sense, and I think this is a point that Deleuze might bring up as well, difference, it only exists in math insofar as it's predicated on identity, right? Because without that basic presupposition of identity, the concept of difference actually wouldn't have any meaning. It wouldn't even exist at all in a sense. So even in order to express something mathematically, what you're presupposing when you translate it from, you could say, one side of equation to the next, right? Or maybe even like entity X to entity Y. you're actually presupposing what I've written about. I call it ontological constancy. So basically, you're presupposing that that entity basically maintains its essence and its nature as it's transmuted from one side of the equation to the next, which is not something that can ever actually be really proven to be the case through mathematics alone, through science alone, right? So already even in mathematics, this is like the really kind of radical Deleuzean critique of mathematics as a means of control. But even mathematics itself actually sort of presupposes identity, right? And this is something where we can actually tie this into Aristotelianism. I want to talk about the Physics by Aristotle because it's quite an important text. And I also want to Newtonian physics is something that I've also mapped out as another kind of means of control. It's also, and I think Deleuze would probably agree with me on this point. I don't know if he specifically wrote about Newtonian physics, right? But already in Newtonian physics, you see this tendency and this orientation towards identity and equality, right? The idea that all of reality and matter essentially converges towards a unified center, right? The centripetal force, right? That there has to be this that all energy is essentially conserved, right? It's maybe I don't want to say that it's easy to see how this all kind of ties into the same broader plane of control, but I think if you think about it a bit more deeply as I have, it actually becomes quite apparent, right? How Newtonian physics kind of fits into the whole psyop, right? And maybe we can even talk about quantum physics a bit later on, because I describe, so in my book, I'm writing a book right now, I describe quantum physics as just great intellectual like executioner in a sense, which even though it does stem from the West in a sense, is again in this very dialectical fashion, has actually yet to be has yet to really be absorbed by it. It's like it's kind of outside of these models of control. It's like, it's what Deleuze would call a royal science, not a royal science, a nomad science, because it really undercuts all of these models, because it has this emphasis on entropy, on kind of unknowability in a sense, on the fact that no, you can't actually presuppose this kind of ontological constancy of any given entity when you transmute it in this mathematical way, right? These ideas of kind of the role of the subject, of subjectivity, right? If you know anything about the observer effect in quantum physics, it's expressed in the simplest terms possible. It's this idea that the investigation of the subject itself, that being the human subject, into any physical system, actually changes the nature of that system. And this is something that has been actually verified through experimental means, right? And which obviously negates this idea of this kind of objectively existing external world, independent of human perception, that modern science and all of these control mechanisms really presuppose, and which is the world that they want us to sort of collide with, in a sense, right? And then in quantum physics, there's also this idea that no, there isn't really this neat chronology of time in a sense. You can't actually sequentialize time into a past, a present, and a future, which is what these models of control like liberalism actually presuppose. Like the whole idea of linear progress actually presupposes that time actually functions in a certain manner, that you can actually chronologize it, which is something that goes back to Aristotelianism, right? To what Aristotle's talking about in the Physics, where he's defining time as essentially a sequence of points that actually operate in space, right? And that's another thing that we can get into, because I find the conflation of time with space, so the definition of it as space-time, actually heavily contributes to this. Because if you conceive time as actually operating in space, you have to sequentialize it, because it's the only way to make sense of it, right? But you would actually, and this is what comes up, by the way, in the debate between Albert Einstein and Henry Bergson in 1922, which is very important, right? If you want to put the Deleuzian lens of that, I think you could say Einstein, even though you could say he's somewhat important in the development of quantum physics, but I wouldn't say that he's a central figure. Obviously, he's more important for things like general relativity and special relativity. But I think if you applied the Deleuzian lens to the argument, you could say that Einstein is representative of the royal, like the cringe royal science, and Bergson would be the based nomad science, if you want to put in the modern colloquialisms, right? But quantum physics actually overturns this chronologization and this sequentialism of time, because it shows us that, well, you can't actually divide time on the sort of tripartite basis in a sense, right? Because we have these processes like entanglement and superposition, where entities actually occupy two, different states simultaneously in terms of like states of time, right? That's what Schrodinger's cat is about. That thought experiment by Erwin Schrödinger is a really important physicist. So there's all of these models that are kind of floating out there that intersect, that all contribute to this these mechanisms of control, right? And then there's certain models that oppose that. I think that's kind of what Deleuze is getting at in when he talks about the difference between um, the royal sciences and the nomad sciences, which correspond to the state, the sedentary state, and the nomad, respectively, right? So that's what the state and the nomad distinction about. Like, to be honest, to be a bit vulgar here, you have to be kind of a retard to assume that he's literally talking about like Mongol nomads in the desert wandering around versus the modern European state. Literally, I mean that's an element of it, but that's such a low IQ kind of pseudo interpretation. So I want to get that out of the way when it comes to Deleuze. But yeah, with the state, there's the sedentary aspect because there's no deviation from this eternality, right? And again, I define that in terms of what linear progress is, which is what modern liberalism kind of holds as its central value. I define that in terms of these cosmological models about the universe, right? The idea of what time is, what space is, what quantity is, how you understand space-time through quantity. That all embodies this kind of staticness, this lack of deviation. And that's also, in a sense, what science itself actually presupposes, right? So, if you study philosophy of science, you'd learn about the problem of induction. It's this major contradiction at the heart of science that, unfortunately, because many contemporary scientists are actually quite uneducated in these manners, unfortunately, and intentionally as a result of this system of power that wants them to maintain this ignorance. They're actually not aware of this, which is very embarrassing because it's so fundamental. But there's this problem in science, which is, well, science presupposes very tellingly this eternality and this staticness. And what I mean by that is, well, I brought up the example of mathematics, right? The tendencies towards equality and identity, and Newtonian physics also privileges this. But that's aligned with this, obviously. But science itself actually presupposes that there's this constancy in nature, right? And what I mean by that is there's this idea that there are these fixed laws of nature. So you can think of the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics, and maybe even the laws of logic in a sense, even though some people would try and actually extricate them from this. They'd say, no, we can't classify them as part of this because they're not actually part of nature in a sense. Well, then you have to define what logic actually is and what actually exists, which is another more difficult question. But science presupposes the existence of these laws of nature, right, that are just always there in a sense. They're static, and that's the only reason that you can actually perform any scientific experiment at all, right? It's the only reason that a physicist, for example, can actually map out the trajectory of a ball that's kicked by a person mathematically. Because if you assume that ball operates according to certain natural laws, right, that it will eventually fall, right, because as a result of the law of gravity, which I don't want to sound too schizo, but I've always found it, this is something I touched on a bit in my book, but there's always been this interesting aspect to the law of gravity, which is a part of this kind of control mechanism where it's this orientation towards this descent, right? Everything has to be pulled downwards, like this kind of leveling process. It's descent into hell, away from this, heavenly light. Everything falls down on me. That might be a bit of a stretch, right? But I thought that could be quite interesting, considering how much of all of these mechanisms of control represent an attack on religion and divinity. And I think, Flying Kabbalah, you touched on that when you talked about this difference between this, rational understanding of the world and this kind of romantic, poetic understanding, which is obviously very important to all of this, right? Because what these mechanisms of control really do is pretty much abolish and phase out any sort of romanticism whatsoever. It's a very dead world that it wants to create, which is the most terrifying aspect of it, right? But, that example in physics, again, it presupposes the constancy of these laws, because otherwise you just wouldn't be able to map the trajectory mathematically of the ball that you kicked. Because if the laws actually changed, then you'd have no way of sort of predicting its future and the way that it actually moves in space-time, right? So, that's an example when it comes to physics. It's like a very simple example. But the problem with this is, and of course it's not just in physics, this is just science itself. Like, this is at the bedrock of science. It's very important, right? You're assuming that the future will be like the past. But the problem behind the problem here is that you can't actually know through science itself and through the empirical process that this will be the case. So you can't actually know that induction exists in a sense. This is the problem of induction. You don't actually know that the future will be like the past, right? It's it's something that you arbitrarily presuppose. It can't actually be proven by the scientific method or through the empirical process itself. And so it's something that's presupposed, but it's also done so on a not really on an arbitrary basis. Now that's what people would I think many kind of not just suits, but if you guys have seen that bell curve meme where it's the guy who's at the bottom percentile, the guy who's at the middle percentile, and the guys who's at the top percentile, and the bottom and the top share the same opinions. There's this trait that I've seen online among guys who think that they've dissected this and boiled it down, where they assume the problem with this is that, oh, well, that means that science is arbitrary. Like, there's no means of actually proving its validity if this is the case. I disagree with that. And I know I've been rambling here, so I'm going to tie it back in. I'm going to hit the accelerator pedal soon. But I actually disagree with that. I don't think that it's arbitrary, that the presupposition of induction or of this staticness in nature, right? I think it actually is based, again, which is what we touched on earlier, from psychological preferences. Because if you assume that the future will be like the past, if you assume that there's this eternality in nature and that these laws actually hold in this static manner permanently, everything becomes much more comfortable and easy in the broadest sense, right? You can sort of operate in life on a daily basis, knowing that, okay, if I do this, this will happen, with X and Y, which is the modus ponens in mathematical logic, right? Which is also part of this. It's really based on this psychological tendency towards comfort, towards an ease of understanding, towards this instantaneity, towards accessibility, which is actually the ultimate, really the end goal, I think, or part of the end goal of all of this linear progress and all of these mechanisms of control and all of these, these simulations and these impositions, in a sense, from this Leibnizian model, the combinatorial machine that generates all possible ideas and all possible intellectualism, so that we don't actually have to produce that, to the scientific process itself, which is about illuminating the world.
I don't believe we actually talked about the Leibniz machine directly.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. But science itself, it's about
we don't have that much time.
Bringing it into, an illumination, by the way, that's actually a very occult kind of concept, which really goes to show what this is all about. But bring the world into our field of vision instantly, where we can mathematize it and we can quantify it, to things like AI and internet, which are about manifesting this process, combining really all possible knowledge so that it's at the tip of our fingertips. This is all privileged towards instantaneity and towards an ease of access, right? And that's mirrored actually in the psychological preferences that constitutes science itself, right? The very presupposition of science, and also the nature of space and time. Because it would be very difficult actually to conceptualize time as independent from space, to conceptualize time as existing independently from quantity, right? So from essentially a sequential progression from one point to the next, to the next, to the next, and so on and so forth. It would certainly be difficult to conceptualize this. Now, difficulty obviously has no bearing on, the difficulty of understanding something has no bearing on its truth. I mean, that's something that even an elementary schooler could understand. Like, that's very fundamental, but they completely negate this. And so, in my view, it's this fundamental, these fundamental configurations of space, of time, of quantity, of what these things are. This staticness, which is related to, the sedentary state that Deleuze talks about. These all are really at the bedrock of this entire crisis, this entire idea of a linear progression of humanity, of reality, of nature, etc., which is actually culminating pretty much in the apocalypse. I mean, just in the destruction of humanity in a sense, and it's really quite fascinating. This is my view, obviously, and I've fleshed this out in greater extent to my in my book, but it's really quite
Well,
fascinating how
it's a
these
very thorough breakdown,
yeah,
and it
these
is
very
only
fundamental.
about like it dives about one fourth into the uh, analysis that you wrote several days ago in response to Killionaire's assumption
Yeah,
that the
I know I've been rambling like a madman here, kind of. But I just the
oh,
last
that was only a
yeah,
piece of the entire notion, the concepts outlined in what you wrote back then. So this is a summary. Treat this as a summary.
yeah. I mean, it's obviously it's
Also, I
heavily
mean,
like
you're making lots of references to the essay itself, so I'm guessing we'll
yeah,
have
I
to
am. But,
upload that what you actually wrote so that people can
yeah,
read it
we
first,
can do
and
that. Yeah,
because
but
Yeah, I
because
think
then
that would be
it'll be
useful.
insanity if people don't actually have a
yeah,
reference to it.
yeah. I sound like the kind of rambling this schizo who's got all of the things that he's pasted to the whiteboard and he's drawing red lines to connect all of them.
Yeah, average Seattle resident.
Yeah, that's kind of what I that is kind of what I sound like right now. But
But it all makes sense when
but
it's
it does. I
connected
think
through
if
the
you think
essay.
about it,
Yes.
if you think about it very, very deeply, and if you do like a shit ton of research and all that, it does come together into an extremely like disturbing but fascinating totality. And it is funny actually that you would bring up that we would bring up schizophrenia because again, this is something we can go into more detail later. But Deleuze is actually famous because he conjures this archetype of the schizo. So he
Oh
says
yeah.
this the schizo actually operates in opposition to all of this because he's defined by this like this entropy in the quantum sense. He's always moving from one train to another in this way that actually defies like a linear chronology. And he means that in the most fundamental sense possible. And that's actually why. So another idea that I have is that I've written about this elsewhere, but and this is actually a result of these processes. If you look at intelligence, so Jacob, you probably know about the Flynn effect, right? Because I mean, we all took AP Psych. I'm sure that you guys all
Yep.
know about this, right? The Flynn effect. Yeah. So
Right.
the
Yep.
Flynn effect is basically this idea for the people who are watching that don't know that human intelligence has essentially gone up over time, and there are different hypotheses for that, but the explanations generally boil down to combination of technological improvements, improvements in healthcare and medicine, right? Better nutrition. So people have access to better. Poverty is shrinking. If you look at global poverty, so people have access to better education. They eat better foods. They have more nutrition, so their brains grow properly. They just become smarter. That's all. That's all well and good. That's all been said in the past. But my take on this is that if you look at the recent trends, we're actually seeing a reversal of this. So maybe this was true in the 20th century when there was still a lot of low-hanging fruit on the ground to be cleared, to use a metaphor, in the sense that many parts of the world still were in abject poverty and they hadn't even industrialized it, right? I mean, obviously, sub-Saharan Africa is still plagued by this to an extent, even though I do think that they are um, moving beyond this. Even though even the term "beyond" is kind of risky here because it implies that this is necessarily a good thing, which is something that's up for debate and which is actually a notion that is at the heart of the problems that we're talking about. But there was a lot of low-hanging fruit in the sense that you had major portions of the world, major portions of human society that were very deindustrialized, that hadn't really gone through the modernization process, so their living standards were generally quite low. They didn't have access to proper medicine, technology, infrastructure, education, right? So once that was all taken care of and once that low-hanging fruit was cleared, which there was a lot of, you saw massive improvements just in intelligence, just as a kind of a direct result of that. But obviously, the whole idea with the low-hanging fruit metaphor is that that low-hanging fruit, there are huge quantities of it, and they're very easy to clear. But the higher and higher you climb up along these trees where the fruit grows, you could say the fruit, not only does the quantity of the fruit decrease, but also the ease with which you can access it, right? So it gets harder and harder to access the fruit because you're climbing higher and higher up the tree. So you need to put more effort into getting the fruit. And the fruit's also not as easily available in terms of the quantity of fruit, right? There's just less fruit. That's what the principle of diminishing returns is about, right? Which is actually, it's interesting how everything ties together because that's now a common concept in economics, and that's actually, and in the social sciences in general, and that's bled its way in large part because of these statistical models, right? Which are part of this kind of system of control. But once that happened, once you got the low-hanging fruit out of the way, which explains a big jump, much of the increase in human intelligence. So it's not some miracle that in and of itself, in my view, is enough to explain it. But what you see actually in the 21st century is I've kind of mapped this out in my own research, and what I've seen is there's actually a decline. Like intelligence has actually been declining, and especially I don't know if you guys have looked at the data on this, but especially in Western societies, and maybe some less developed countries are still climbing ahead because they have some room to be made, or no, they have some ground to clear just in terms of basic aspects of modernization, industrialization, right? Like not all of the world is equally modernized and industrialized, and not all of the world has even gone through that process in the first place. But if you look at these big industrial societies I'm talking about, there's actually been a pretty consistent reversal of this trend, like of the Flynn effect, which is something that not many people are aware of, but you've actually seen a decline. So you can even map this in America in particular, but it's not just America, it's Western Europe, it's Canada, it's kind of the West more broadly. Maybe not in some East Asian countries, which then again, it depends on whether or not you classify those as part of the West. But you're seeing this decline in intelligence over the past 1 or 2 decades or so. But it's not actually it's not a uniform decline. And what I mean by that is, intelligence doesn't just function on a single axis, right? I mean, this should be clear to people. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but if you study anything about the psychology of intelligence, first of all, the IQ test itself was actually made by psychologists, and there are different models that are used, different standardized models. They're all based on these psychological theories, essentially, that professional academic psychologists came up with. So this already falls within the domain of psychology by virtue of that. But if you study the psychology of intelligence, you learn that, okay, so intelligence is not defined along a single axis. There are actually different forms according to the mainstream understanding, right? There's verbal intelligence, and this actually plays out in society too. Like people pursue different paths and there's a lot of really fascinating research on this, but there's actually some recent findings showing that personality differences as well as people's careers choices actually correlate somewhat to these divergences in intelligence, the types of intelligence that people possess, right? So one form is, I'm not going to describe all of them, and then there are some others that people have thrown into the mix, like EQ, which is, basically emotional intelligence, which is kind of its own territory that we don't really need to get into right now. I wouldn't really consider that to be part of what the IQ test tests anyways. But what it tests is, okay, verbal intelligence. So that's going to be which is also, that would be, think of what would correlate essentially to, the verbal section on SAT. It's quite self-explanatory. It's just your command over words, over expression, right? People with higher verbal intelligence, they tend to be able to speak more eloquently. They tend to gravitate to fields like law. They tend to be to write and speak at a fairly blistering rate, right? They can be faster speakers, all of that. That's verbal intelligence. Your command, your mastery and manipulation of words, right? But there's another type of intelligence actually, which is called, in rough terms, it's called spatio-visual intelligence. It's actually completely different. Now, I don't want to say that there's no correlation whatsoever. That's not the case. Generally speaking, if you look at the people that scored the highest on IQ tests, they will score quite high, or at least far above the average in both. Like it's very, very rare to see someone who scores exceptionally high in one domain and then exceptionally low in the other, or exceedingly low in the other, maybe, because it's not really exceptional in terms of a positive connotation. That's very rare. Like generally speaking, you will see a correlation between these two axes, right? But past a certain level, that correlation becomes a bit muddied, and it becomes a bit unclear. And you actually see that it's almost as if there's this specialization, this process of mental specialization. And now, because of advancements in neuroscience, where we're getting closer to mapping out the brain, we can actually trace this to different physical locations in the brain, right? Because
Are we able to quickly relate this back to the?
Yeah, I will.
the
I'm sorry, it is. I know I'm rambling, but it is important. But we can actually map this to different parts of the brain through neuroscience, and where this ties in actually is, visual spatial intelligence actually concerns what it concerns is essentially the manipulation, the rotation of objects in space, right? think of things like Rubik's cubes, or the quantity of cubes that you can imagine in your head spinning, right? Puzzles, right, where you have to mechanically combine these shapes and interlock them with each other, right? That's what spatial visual intelligence actually measures, in contrast to verbal intelligence. And so my theory on this, and how you could, Deleuze never talked about this specifically, this is more my contribution, is that there's this, well, first of all, what you've seen is, what ties into the decline in intelligence, is verbal intelligence has actually gone down. If you look at the data, it's gone down quite significantly in Western societies. But spatial visual intelligence, for the most part, has actually gone up, right? So there's this contrast, and it's this really fascinating trend. So that's why when I say that intelligence has gone down, you have to be more specific about it, right? You can't just say, broadly speaking, intelligence has. You have to delineate and kind of demarcate between the different types, right? So verbal has gone down for the most part, spatial visual has increased. And that's very telling, because there's this, sounds, quite abstract, but verbal intelligence, in a sense, is it's a part of the bedrock of humanity, in a sense, of human nature, in the sense that it always has to be tied to the human subject, right? Like, that's what constitutes it, and it's always culturally and socially embedded, right? Whereas on the other hand, spatial visual intelligence doesn't actually require this kind of social and cultural embedding, right? It exists completely outside of that. That's why it can't even be. It can really only be represented and sort of manifest in these mathematical activities, right? That's what would in these scientific activities. That's what would actually utilize spatial visual intelligence to the greatest degree. And these are activities that can actually really be performed as just, if not to a much higher extent, by computers than by humans, right? If you ask the most advanced computers and most advanced AI systems are going to be much better at solving these types of spatial visual puzzles than even the most exceptional humans are, right? And you could say that, oh well, now these systems can actually simulate language, so isn't that dichotomy kind of a false dichotomy? Well, that's not actually quite the case, because there is an objectivity to spatial visual intelligence that doesn't actually manifest in language, right? And what I mean by that is, not only in reference to the constancy that I was talking about earlier, but a shape interlocks with another shape in a completely fixed manner, right? It either locks in with it or it doesn't. Like, it either rotates in this specific manner or it doesn't. That's why there's no subjectivity when it comes to something like a Rubik's cube. I'm explaining this in very simple fundamental terms, because it gets quite tricky. But there's this objectivity to it. You're either right or you're wrong, and there's no in between. So it's already very mathematical in that sense, right? Like, that's kind of the basis of mathematics that I talked about earlier. It's that ontological constancy, when you reproduce something from one side of the equation to another. But verbal intelligence can never actually be defined on this type of axiom, right? It doesn't function in this manner. And that's quite interesting, because you see this rise in spatial visual intelligence, and it almost reflects actually the nature of these systems of control in the first place, because they all completely align with this, right? And so that's also manifesting in society. Like, that's why what you see right now is many of the highest paid jobs, and there may be some minor exceptions, but the direction that society is actually going in right now in terms of what we privilege, like the types of intellectual activity that we privilege the most, and which is evidenced by the jobs that are in the highest salaries right now, just the fields that are going through the most kind of hype and innovation, you could say, are the fields that utilize this. They actually don't really require that much of verbal intelligence. They're much more heavily privileged towards spatial visual intelligence. And that is almost like the most clear kind of manifestation of this on a societal level, but it's much deeper than that. I actually, in my own work, I'd say I'd align spatial visual intelligence with this, you could say the royal sciences, and verbal intelligence with the nomad scientists. This is sciences. This isn't something that Deleuze specifically pointed to, but it also manifests in the fact that when you look at schizophrenia, this is another interesting rabbit hole for you guys to explore. A lot of what's kind of perceived as schizophrenia and defined as schizophrenia, what the average person and even the expert would see and instantly think, yeah, this is just schizo shit, basically. Actually is a manifestation of high verbal intelligence, because it more easily facilitates these very kind of abstract interconnections between these different concepts that can be explained with language, right? Even, I brought it, when I talked about something like gravity being this kind of satanic downward descent, pull towards hell, right? We're going to talk about science is about illuminating the world, right? And illumination itself is like a very kind of occult concept. These would all be manifestations of that. Like, everyone's familiar with the the idea of the schizo going down the rabbit hole and making all these connections, and that's really, in a sense, a manifestation of much higher verbal intelligence. So there's already this kind of revolutionary and subversive aspect to this, in opposition to spatial visual intelligence, which is what's enshrined by these systems of control, which is essentially what their modality is, and right. But the thing is, they can't actually conceive of language as separate from that, in a sense, because language is something that's is culturally and socially embedded, and that is therefore subjective. It can't really be graded on the same level as, say, a mathematical equation can, where it's either right or wrong. It actually fundamentally transcends that. But they can't even conceive of it in this manner because of the limitations aforementioned, the limitations in question. So what they do is, in a sense, they bring language down to this level. In a sense, they actually conceptualize it through spatial visual intelligence and through spatial rotation. And what I mean by that is, I hinted at this earlier, but if language is just a part, it stems from intelligence, which is a part of the material world, then that means that necessarily it can actually be simulated. This is also another very Leibnizian idea. It can be mathematically simulated, and it can be expressed through in these computational terms, right? And so then language actually becomes all about syntax. And what syntax is, if you study linguistics, is essentially this idea that all that language boils down to, in a sense, and even human language, is really essentially these mathematical kind of patterns. And what I mean by that is they're
Well, in
specific.
linguistics, syntax is basically how
Yeah.
words
Yeah,
and everything is arranged.
How they plug into each other, right?
Yeah.
It's like, so this idea that there are these formal rules of logic that actually kind of govern any grammar, like govern sentences, and they are actually, in a sense, arbitrary, as I mentioned before, but they're taken so that there's a sense of staticness and constancy in the structure, right? And so when you get that understanding, really all that language is just, it's like as you said, Flankable, it's these kind of entities that plug into each other on this and interlock with each other on the basis of this what is it? The kind of formal logic that underpins it. That's already represents the kind of infiltration of spatial visual and reasoning into language itself, right? And so, but the problem with that is, because it's arbitrary, because it's so mathematical, what you actually get is this idea that, well, if that's really the basis of language, sentences do not necessarily need to possess any sort of meaning to actually be syntactically sound, and so to actually constitute sentences in the first place. And this is really what people like Noam Chomsky in the 20th century get into, right? Very famous linguist. And this is what I hinted at this earlier when I see it's very, very telling that you see the emphasis in syntax, on syntax and linguistics as an academic discipline really arises in the 20th century, right? With these ideas like universal grammar and generative grammar, which are obviously things that Chomsky pioneered. But Chomsky's big kind of early masterwork in the first half of his career, of his academic and intellectual career, was this book. I believe it's called Syntactic Structures. I think maybe it was a thesis that he wrote for some academic institution, which he later made into a book. But what's really famous from that work, which is also infiltrated and kind of penetrated the popular consciousness and pop culture, is this very famous sentence. It's colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Maybe you guys have heard of this sentence, or maybe the listeners have heard of this, because it's quite a it's used a lot in many introductory textbooks, and it's, like I said, it's kind of part of pop culture now, to the extent that these complex linguistic ideas can even be said to be part of pop culture in the first place. But that's another matter. But the importance of that sentence is that it's actually completely correct syntactically. So it obeys the rules of the formal logic that actually constitutes syntax, right? The mechanisms of interlinkage and interconnection from one entity in the sentence to the next, right? This mathematical model. But it's actually meaningless in terms of the meaning that can be imparted and sort of passed on to a actual human who has this kind of innate understanding of the world in a social and a cultural manner, right? And of language as actually embedded in social and cultural context. This is completely divorced from that. A sentence like "colorless green ideas sleep furiously." It's in terms of meaning, it's actually incoherent, but it's syntactically perfectly sound. And I think that's a really good microcosm of what this destruction of language on the most fundamental level that we're seeing unfold actually kind of represents. When you
Okay, I think we
describe
should be wrapping up.
yeah, when you describe a language as syntax, you actually in a sense remove it from humanity. Like you're extricating it, almost like a surgeon who's extricating it from the beating, organic heart of humanity. And you're actually but that arises when you place language within the realm of spatial visual intelligence. And then from there, what happens is, well, if language can be boiled down to syntax, which functions on a fundamentally mathematical basis, because the basis of any syntactic structure is like I said, it's a formal proof, or it's formal logic. That's actually the basis of mathematics, because for any mathematical equation or problem boils down to proving really that x equals x in a sense, or x equals y. That's a very, very Aristotelian concept as well, right? That principle of identity and equality, which I already mentioned how that's a kind of a problem earlier on in this podcast, how that gives way to these mechanisms of control. But if language can be reduced to these structures which interlink with each other in this manner, in this mathematical manner, then that means that you can simulate language in a sense. Another very Leibnizian idea. It has to be structured this way in order for you to actually be able to simulate and reproduce language, right? And that's what the basis actually of artificial intelligence is. And what of language learning models, of these chatbots, these things like Chat GPT. And it's actually very, very telling that one of the earliest AI systems, in a sense, in the 20th century, was developed by this Chinese thinker. His name escapes me at the moment, but he was actually not only a logician and a mathematician, but also a philosopher with a lot of experience in both analytic and continental philosophy. So very well-versed intellectual. And he came up with a very primitive AI, I believe, in the 1960s, and one of the earliest models. And all that it did, or at least its main achievement that it garnered a lot of notoriety and attention for, was proving all of the proofs in this book called Principia Mathematica by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead. By the way, Russell and Whitehead, very significant. Russell is an extremely suspicious figure. He's basically like this deep state kind of operative. He's affiliated with the Royal Society, which is just this elite kind of British, circle of intelligence. Yeah, it's this Anglo box. This is something that I really target in my work. British intelligence
it sounds like something that ChatGPT could do easily these days.
British intelligence is actually very kind of tied into this. But he also, because Flying Kabbalah, you brought up this idea about the conception of reality as mathematical. Well, yeah, that's basically what people like Russell believe in. Actually, that's what they propose. I call it panlogicism.
Can we relate this really quickly?
Yeah, I'll relate it. So really quick. Yeah, really, really quickly. So that AI, what it was famous for was proving all of the proofs in Principia Mathematica by Russell and Whitehead, which is a book about coming up with the foundations of mathematics, right? Very, very important text in that regard. It's famous because it has this super, super intricate long proof for 1 + 1 = 2. That AI was famous just for doing that, for proving all of those proofs that are in that book, which is very, very telling in this regard, right? And so then, from there you get these, you get these things like AI. You get these, language learning models and chatbots, right? That's really the kind of penetration of spatial visual intelligence, you could say, into the realm of language. But all that it produces is destruction. It's this is very dialectical. It produces language technically because it's just spitting out code, which is what happens whenever you ask ChatGPT to do something for you. but it's really destroying language because again, it's this penetration of spatial visual intelligence into the realm of language, which completely detaches it from humanity, detaches it from meaning, and it just functions on this self-referential kind of circular, nonsensical basis, right? Because the actual mathematical logic behind it is arbitrary, right? It's it just kind of floats. You know, it doesn't actually exist in any sort of reality that you can pinpoint, right? It's just something that's taken as a psychological preference. Right, and that's how you get these meaningless sentences that are syntactically sound, like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, the famous Chomskyan example. And then that goes even further, if you want to go further down the rabbit hole. Well, Chomsky himself, his main academic project, which, by the way, he's not really a very revolutionary thinker in my view. Like, you know, he identifies as an anarchist, which is very telling because we all know, if you've been listening to this podcast, you definitely know that anarchism, at least in the West, is really almost like the exact opposite of what it kind of purports to be. If anything, and we were actually just talking about this before we started the podcast, but it actually facilitates these mechanisms of control. You know, it claims to be anti-corporate, anti-capitalist, even anti-state, but it really just actually facilitates those three entities that I mentioned. So that's another aspect of this that's very telling. But the supposed radical anarchist actually completely falls in line with the system, in the sense that he uses this idea of language, this language as reducible to syntactic manipulation, to show, as part of his broader project of showing that human beings are actually fundamentally rational, right? Because intelligence is such a key component of what it means to even be a human. It's how we just navigate our everyday world. And from intelligence, you get language, right? And so if you boil down language to these structures, that's a very, very strong proof in his Chomskyan view, in the Chomskyan position, for humans being, you know, fundamentally rational, which is something that he has also tried to prove quite extensively, and which really just goes to show the actual counter-revolutionary nature of his entire project, despite what he would write about, right? And obviously, he's very involved with military intelligence. When he was a professor at MIT for a while, which is really kind of a haven of the deep state. In the 1960s, he actually contributed his language models specifically were used by the U.S. military to actually facilitate their military their research, their development of these weapons technology. So it all ties together. It's just a very, very complex rabbit hole. And yeah, it's that model of rationality that is at the bedrock of these models, like game theory and cybernetics, right? And one more thing that I'll say before I let, because Jacob left the podcast, it was quite late for him. He's in Poland right now, so he probably got a bit tired. I'm still here with Flying Kabbalah. It's quite, what's interesting here too is, you know, we talked about cybernetics earlier and how there's this idea of, there's actually ultimately there's this idea of circularity in cybernetics, in the sense that the input feeds into the output. Which really, but that just in turn feeds back into the input, so you get this kind of causal loop, right? This circular loop, the endless feedback loop, which is at the heart of cybernetics. Well,
Anyways, okay, I want to comment on, generally speaking, on what you said. So when we were talking about the Flynn effect, you eventually progressed into the delimitation of intelligence, of verbal versus spatiotemporal intelligence. I think the insight, the kind of the claims that you made, I think certainly makes sense to an extent, because there definitely seems to be more societal value, I guess, in a sense. For instance, for jobs that require, I guess, spatiotemporal intelligence. So, for instance, computer science, right? So,
Yes.
programming. I guess that's kind of at the bedrock of really things like AI and computers, right? So, and the reason as to why they get valued so much is you see that they're one of the most well-paid jobs in general in modern society. But I think another take on this aspect between, like, basically you just dissed in a sense of verb or spatiotemporal intelligence
No, I
and
think
praised
it's
verbal
not
intelligence.
about dissing it, but it's more about well, I think
You
pointing
didn't
out what it
present an entirely
yeah, yeah, it's
positive
more about
point.
pointing out what it
But
no, what it aligns with, what it's constituted by,
mhm.
what's actually necessary to perform it, and what it represents in a broader sense, and how it actually penetrates into the realm of language. So when you configure language along these lines, that would be
Yeah, yeah,
shaped
yeah.
by spatial visual reasoning, you get a very certain result, which is actually playing out in real time. But yeah, go ahead. I mean, I know it did
Well,
make it
my
seem.
take, what I want to say
Yeah.
is that ultimately, when you analyze verbal intelligence, it just has to do with talking, right? So people with high
Yeah.
verbal intelligence are good talkers. Meanwhile, I think greatness, generally, or in its historical context, is more associated with the spatiotemporal intelligence. So one thing, so,
I think the
I
precise
think you can
word
definitely
is
bring up not
spatial
investors,
visual.
but you can definitely bring up inventors in history. So I think if not even just post-industrial inventors, but for instance, the inventors of paper, right? So if
Yes.
one country is known worldwide for making some sort of invention that benefits all of humanity, so for instance, paper, right?
Yes.
So pretty much universally recognized to have origin in China. It's something that people are proud of. And also you have thinkers that, so even Plato and like Aristotle, they're one of the
Yes.
most praised thinkers, really, regardless of what you think about each one of their particular ideas that they contribute to philosophy. Really, people, they left a great historical presence and great historical influence,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So
Certainly.
in that sense, I think if you just try to analyze spatiotemporal intelligence and verbal intelligence by themselves, I think in a sense there kind of is a sort of, maybe not superior, maybe superiority is not the right word, but I think more of a greatness associated with spatio temporal
Yeah. I
intelligence.
think the specific
So
term would be spatial visual. I mean, I don't want to nitpick in this regard. And obviously, I talked earlier about the spatial temporality and how it relates to this, right? Yeah. No, those are certainly good points. But I think because Jacob left and we've been going on for quite a long time, we were initially going to have our friend Raphael join us.
right.
I think,
Um,
but
yeah.
he
Anyways,
actually
I think we should
messaged me
definitely
not too
start
long ago
wrapping
that
up now
he can't
because I
actually
think the
make it.
recording's over 1 hour and 30 minutes long.
Yeah, we touched on quite a lot, but it was actually a very, very fascinating very fascinating discussion. And I know that I kind of rambled on and talked at length, but I hope that I put forth some interesting ideas, interesting concepts for the audience to digest and to chew on for a decent period of time. And yeah, I mean that about wraps up the podcast. Very interesting deep dive into these interrelated topics and into reality and existence in a sense. And this is all also something that this is everything that I touched on for the purposes of the conveying this to the audience who's listening right now. Everything that I touched on is really part of my broader intellectual project that I'm working on, that I've been working on for, I'd say, about the past year or so, perhaps. Which is actually it's also very, very it's very deeply and directly connected to the geopolitical struggles, even though it might seem kind of abstract at first how that interrelation forms. The geopolitical struggles that we touched on in the beginning of the podcast, that we've also talked about at length in the earlier podcast episodes, which you could actually, in a sense, say that I've been studying since I was a little child, really. Ever since I became obsessed with the Syrian civil war when I was a kid, which is obviously a big part of this clash that we're seeing unfold before us today. But really, if you're interested in what I talked about in the podcast, follow my channel. It's just it's Jordan at Jordan's Analysis on YouTube. I upload a lot of videos like this, a lot of good interviews, deep dives, discussions. That I'd like to think are at least as stimulating as the one that we engaged in today in this podcast. This is again is forms these all form kind of sections and segments of my broader intellectual projects, just piecing together all of these very, very dense and intricate threads whose connections and intersections might not seem very apparent to the average individual, but I do firmly, and I'll really say this with my hand to my heart and my hand to God. I firmly believe are the case. I firmly believe exist. I firmly believe are extremely significant in what's unfolding today. These are all things that I explore in much greater detail in my book, for instance, in my writings and my essays that I have on platforms like Substack. So if the viewers are at all interested in that, they should not only exercise some patience and wait for me to drop my book, because it is going to be coming out. I've mentioned it before on the previous podcast, but I am aiming for a 2024 release. If I could just plug this briefly for a second, I hit about 830 pages not too long ago, maybe about 2 weeks ago, and I think it'll close, or it'll conclude at at a length of about 1,000 pages. That seems to be the direction that it's going in, but it might actually exceed that to get closer to 1,100 or 1,200. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think it'll make quite an original and fascinating contribution, and it explores everything that I touched on in this podcast today with Flying Kabbalah and with Jacob, but obviously owing to the book format in much greater detail, greater precision, right, a little bit greater clarity to an extent. And yeah, I think the Scorpion Movement listeners, and really everyone, any thinking, breathing human would really benefit from reading it and would enjoy it quite a lot. That's what I'll plug to end off the podcast. Obviously, subscribe to Scorpion Movement, like and comment if you haven't already. And Flying Kabbalah, you like to promote or plug, for lack of a better word?
Well, I think that's a pretty good summary, to be honest. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.